So this is the pose I decided to execute on, and I think it's pretty close to the sketch. Kind of making up what she's gonna wear on the go because I don't have anything planned yet. Yeah. I think we're making pretty good time. This piece is due sometime today, preferably before the guys leave the office. I think I'm gonna leave the costume blank for now until I decide what to do with it, and until then I'm just gonna work on the background so we could get the momentum going still. Okay, so the pencils are now ready to mask off, and I'm going to start the watercolors, which is going to be the background. Added some egrets in the back and in the foreground as well. So I decided to ditch my inexpensive Angora watercolors by Canson. For this piece, I'm actually using the Yatsutomo Sumie watercolor set. It's got a higher quality pigment, so you use less water to try to get the same amount of, not the same amount, more out of it, basically. By no means am I a watercolor expert, but hopefully by experimenting with some of these watercolors as I work on this piece, I'll be able to bring more value to the table and give you guys some of the knowledge that I've figured out. The process for this piece right here in the background, I actually sprayed a little bit of water with a spray bottle, squirt bottle, to kind of dampen the paper a little bit before I overlaid the base tones for the background. I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough time to put a mask on this piece so that I could separate the foreground from the background better and not have to be so careful about the edges. But it turns out that because I did it that way, I'd have to be, I could be less careful about how I painted the background, and it was a lot more seamless that way. I had a pretty decent idea for where the foliage was going to go for the background because I found a lot of references of Manoa Falls on Google. I was planning on hiking the actual trail, except it's been raining a lot lately, so there's a chance for mudslides and just it could get really slippery out there. Okay, this is the fun part where we basically get to take off the masking. But I've taken the masking off of gray, so we're gonna do it off of the egrets. Hopefully I don't tear what's underneath because I'm so impatient right now. Be careful of this part. Less worried about stabbing myself with the X-Acto knife and more worried about messing up my piece. I spent so long on it. All day to be exact. A good part to just pry it off. Oh. Okay. I decided to go with the multi-liners for this piece because I wanted to have a more painterly look to go with the background, which is all going to be fully watercolors. And if I wanted to go in and have more of a contrast, I could always use my inks later on, the black inks, the India inks, and stuff like that. Plus the speed that comes with not having to dip your inks and then inking can't be beat right now, especially with smaller, tighter deadlines. You want to do as much as you can and still get the look that you're trying to go for. So multi-liner is quicker, brush and nibs and inks a little bit longer. You might accidentally smudge the ink at times, so it all depends. But with the short amount of time, I always like to go with the tools that will allow me to work the quickest. Even though I'm trying to do this as fast as I can with the allotted time, I also have to figure out how to methodically put every single piece together. So working on a composition and like a value scale that was going to allow me to do that was probably the key to this piece right here. Grace is a very colorful character, so I had to use the waterfall in the back and the birds that are kind of laid throughout the whole entire piece to make the piece pop, and also to save myself some time and only having to render bits and pieces of it instead of the whole entire thing. I came up with a composition that allowed me to focus mainly on grace and still achieve that look of depth and contrast. So that's why I chose the birds that are all white, and then the waterfall is a lot more high contrast and just kind of detailing the edges of it to imply that it's a waterfall. That being said, I don't really have to ink the background and the birds, and I'm only focused on inking Grace. That also brings her into the foreground and creates a contrast between her, the birds, and the background. I've actually penciled and inked enough times where I don't actually have to bring my pencils to a full finish, and I could kind of add in the detail as I go when I'm inking. And I think that's where the skill of coming up with the broader shapes and the composition of your piece is so important, because you could get away with putting in the detail later, so long as you have the basic shapes formed already onto the piece and the composition. You know, and composition and just basic shapes, that's kind of the skill that I'm still kind of striving towards right now, because it's so difficult. It's an easy concept to understand, but to train your eyes and your mind to see things as just simple shapes, it's a really tough skill to learn. I try to be very careful when I'm inking the face and even coloring the face, because the more mistakes you make, the more you're going to have to go in and fix stuff, especially when you're working with traditional mediums. It's not always the easiest thing to fix, and then it kind of gets you off your like your mojo, I guess you could say. I would always use like a slightly smaller nib or multi-liner or brush, if I was using a brush, to ink the face, just to make sure that I get it pretty much close to what I had in mind, because like I said, I don't really bring my pencils to a complete finish, so I'm kind of having to add in some of the finer details later on. However, if there's a time where I know for sure that the face is the focal point, I will actually detail most of it in the sketch form before I actually start inking. Inking hair can be really tricky because we all have this tendency to over render and draw every strand of hair that we see. Hair in itself is like a character, so I always consider the form and even the function of what the hair is doing. It could create movement. If it's short hair, it also creates mood, so I always look at basic shapes just like I do with composition, and try to render according to the shape or the flow that I'm going for. Grace has very colorful hair, so I also wanted to make sure I had enough room to render with Copic markers the different colors that she has. She has anywhere between 4 to 5 to 6 colors, gradations of color inner hair, and it makes the piece pop. So if I over render this hair with ink, then you're probably not going to see much of the color that would be most of her hair. Laying in the base skin tones is very important because it helps me visualize and establish the light and dark and the shadows, even though it's it's not very contrasty, but it's important to lay that foundation down first. So I tend to leave some spots completely white, or I don't actually shade it in, just in case I want to keep it really bright in certain areas, and I don't actually have to go in and use like a gel pen in case I want it to be a high key or like a really bright light source. And if I decide I want to make it a darker piece, then I just go in and actually color in the whites that I left on the paper. I should add that it's not a bad thing to add your highlights and your shadows or vice versa, except if I'm trying to be more cautious and I'm not quite confident about the lighting situation yet or the tone that I want to set, I tend to kind of leave that a little open and then process it from light to dark. So I'm putting in the mid-tones, and a lot like just the base color, it just helps define the shadows even more and where I'd want my harsh lighting. Let's just say I don't want harsh lighting, then I basically could stop at the mid-tones instead of having to build on it. I treat Copic markers a lot like I would treat watercolors. I tend to add like pinks and reddish tones to the nose, the fingertips and the ears and the cheeks, just to give it like that warm glow on a person's skin. I guess the thing to remember is to use a warmer tone than the base skin tone to kind of achieve that glow. Grace has sparkly kind of fairy dust in her hair, and so the gel pens were actually kind of perfect to render this out traditionally, because so Peter has brushes that he creates in Photoshop where he renders it out like that, and he also does the same thing I do, and sometimes he uses white paint. So this was actually the best material for kind of getting that point across. Her wings are a lot like her hair, where it's got the kind of fairy dust sparkle to it. So I had to make sure that the undertone or the watercolors that I picked was going to be dark enough to have that show through, and also so that it's not too dark, because her wings are kind of transparent or translucent, so you could kind of see through it a little bit. I loaded my brush lightly so that I could add the greens and the blues and the brown that would be part of the background, so it looks like her wings are somewhat transparent. Since I wanted this piece to maintain a very painterly kind of soft look, I decided to go with a sepia tone Prisma brush pen in order to achieve that look. And I also did that with the hair and the wings. I didn't outline with any black. The only black I think I used in this painting was her eyelashes and parts of the eyes to the birds. These Prisma markers came in a pack of 8, so I was able to use the different colors to outline her hair, her wings, her clothing, and her skin tone. I might also add, this is not Copic marker proof, so that's why I have to do it afterwards and not beforehand. Painting in the waterfall was a lot like painting the hair, where you could easily overdo it, because of course I love my gel pens, and I love to render, which is easy to over render. And without the gel pen, at first it looked like I basically forgot to render something in the background. It was just a white kind of blob. It didn't have any form or shape whatsoever. So I kind of had to squint my eyes a few times here just to make sure I'm keeping the basic shape of the waterfall and not overdoing it to the side, and maybe even making it too in focus, where you would lose focus of Grace and even the birds in the foreground. I feel like the meat of the composition was actually heavily reliant on the fluid movement between the birds and the waterfall and Grace's arm or hand going up. So I'm going in and adding finer details in the background, making some of the leaves more detailed, and kind of helps pop out the background, because right now everything seems sort of like it's really blurry, and just there's no real definition with the background, and it doesn't even look like it's actually Hawaii. So it's not until I added some accents to make it look like coconut trees and some of the vines that kind of grow around that waterfall that it starts to kind of come together. So this is the quote-unquote fairy dust that I was talking about. Just using my gel pen again to add accents to the wings and kind of making it pop. And you can never have too much fairy dust. I think it actually makes you fly. At least it makes Grace fly. It started to rain a lot outside. Is it bad that I enjoy the rain? Perfect timing. I think I'll go outside and play in the rain. Just joking. Let's get this. Oh yeah. Yeah. Let's try. Alright. This is terrible. Terrible. Oh, go this way.